In the summer of 1941, German engineers at a Wehrmacht testing facility examined a captured American vehicle and wrote their assessment. The vehicle was a Willys MB, a quarter-ton, four-wheel drive reconnaissance car. The engineers were thorough. They measured the wheelbase, tested the engine, evaluated the suspension, examined the materials and construction quality. Their assessment was professional and accurate. The vehicle was primitive. The engine, a four-cylinder, 60-horsepower unit, was small and underpowered. The body was open to the elements. The suspension was unsophisticated. The interior was Spartan to the point of uncomfortable. The vehicle had clearly been designed to a price: function over refinement, producibility over precision. By the standards that had produced the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, the standard Wehrmacht light vehicle, the American machine was not impressive. The German engineers were correct in their assessment. They were also completely wrong about what they were assessing. What they were measuring was the engineering. What they were not measuring was the strategy behind it. The Jeep, as American soldiers had already named it, was not designed to be impressive. It was designed to go everywhere, carry everything, break down rarely, and be fixed by anyone with basic mechanical knowledge using parts that were available anywhere. It was designed for a war that Germany had not fully prepared for. After the war ended, U.S. Army historian Hugh Cole interviewed Wehrmacht generals about the American equipment they had faced. The interviews were thorough, and the generals were candid. Professional soldiers assessing the tools of a war they had lost, with the specific, honest attention of men who had fought against those tools for years. Cole asked them what single piece of American equipment they had admired most. The Jeep. Every general named the Jeep. Not because it was the most powerful, because it was the most useful. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army throughout the war, was a professional soldier of the precise, unsentimental kind. When he described the Jeep as America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, he was being precise. Of all the things American industry had produced, the Sherman tanks, the Liberty ships, the B-29s, the penicillin, the landing craft, Marshall had identified the Jeep as the single most important contribution. Dramatic weapons win engagements. Important weapons win wars. The difference is often not firepower, or range, or armor, but the unglamorous capacity to be present. The Jeep was present everywhere. From the first American deployment in North Africa in 1942 to the final advances into Germany in 1945, the Jeep went where the Army went. It carried officers, wounded, communications equipment, ammunition, food, and fuel. It pulled light artillery. It mounted machine guns and anti-tank weapons. It was converted into ambulances, command vehicles, and reconnaissance platforms. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoirs, listed it as one of 4 tools that won the war in Europe, alongside the bulldozer, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport plane. 4 items. The Jeep was the smallest. It was also the only one that every American soldier, regardless of branch or specialty, encountered every day. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent more time with American troops than any other journalist, called it a divine instrument of wartime locomotion. The Jeep was divine in the way useful things become divine in conditions of extreme need, by being there. 640,000 were built. The German engineers who examined one in 1941 had concluded it was primitive. They were right. The primitive vehicle was also everywhere, and everywhere, it turned out, was what won. The Jeep was born in 18 hours. In June 1940, the United States Army issued a requirement for a light reconnaissance vehicle. The specifications were demanding, and the timeline was impossible. Any manufacturer wishing to bid had to submit a working prototype within 49 days. Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, was the only manufacturer willing to try. Their engineer, Karl Probst, received the specifications on July 17, 1940. 18 hours later, he had a design. Not a sketch, a complete engineering design for a vehicle that met every Army specification. Quarter-ton payload, 4-wheel drive, 3-man crew, wheelbase under 75 inches, height under 40 inches, weight under 1,300 pounds. The Army had given manufacturers 49 days. Probst had taken 18 hours. He had done it by making a specific philosophical choice that the German engineers who later examined the result found so obvious as to be primitive. He had designed for function and ignored everything else. Reliable, simple enough to maintain without specialized training. Parts interchangeable across as many vehicles as possible. Producible in large numbers by factories that had never built military vehicles. Light enough to be carried in a glider. Not elegant, not comfortable, not impressive to German automotive engineers. It would work. The Army tested the prototype and found it worked. Then, in a decision that Bantam executives found infuriating but that proved strategically crucial, the Army shared the design with Willys-Overland and Ford. Only they had the manufacturing infrastructure to produce at the scale the Army anticipated. Willys and Ford took the design, made refinements. Willys developed a more powerful version of the Go Devil engine that became standard, and began mass production. By 1945, Willys had produced 360,000 Jeeps. Ford had produced 280,000 more, 640,000 vehicles. The German automotive industry, in the same period, produced approximately 50,000 Kübelwagons. A capable machine designed with the precision and sophistication that German engineering typically produced. 50,000 versus 640,000. This was not primarily a production capacity difference. It was a design philosophy difference. The Kübelwagen had been designed to be a good vehicle. The Jeep had been designed to be produced in enormous numbers, used by untrained mechanics, and maintained with whatever tools were available. The Jeep's simplicity was its industrial strategy made visible. The Army needed a vehicle that a 19-year-old from a farm in Iowa could maintain in a jungle in New Guinea. The Jeep's engine had fewer parts than the Kübelwagens. Its chassis was more accessible. Its repairs could be performed with a basic toolkit. A German engineer looking at the Jeep in 1941 saw a primitive vehicle. An American general looking at the Jeep in 1944 saw 600,000 mechanics who could keep it running anywhere on Earth. Both were looking at the same machine. Only one understood what it was for. The Wehrmacht's equivalent was the Kübelwagen, designed by Ferdinand Porsche, sophisticated, fuel-efficient, praised by German engineering journals. Its rear-wheel drive made it less capable off-road than the Jeep's four-wheel drive. In sand, mud, and snow, the Kübelwagen had limits the Jeep did not. The German engineers who tested the Jeep had noted the four-wheel drive and assessed it as unnecessary complication. In European road conditions, they reasoned, it was overkill. North Africa was not European road conditions, nor was New Guinea, nor was the mud of the Ardennes in December 1944, nor were the bombed-out roads of Germany itself in 1945, where craters and rubble had made ordinary roads extraordinary challenges. The Jeep's four-wheel drive, which German engineers had called unnecessary, turned out to be exactly necessary in every theater of the war. Probst had designed for the war that would happen. The German engineers had assessed the vehicle for the war they expected. In November 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel captured a Jeep. What was unusual was what Rommel did with it. He kept it for himself. Rommel had been moving around the battlefield in various German vehicles. He had formed professional opinions about all of them. The Jeep was different. The qualities German engineers had assessed as primitive translated into a vehicle that could go where the battlefield actually was, rather than where roads permitted. North Africa was sand, rock, dried riverbeds, terrain that tested vehicles in ways no German testing facility had modeled. The Jeep went through it. Rommel recognized what he was driving. He did not stop using it. This was the specific quality that the German engineering assessment had missed. Not the vehicle's individual specifications, but its behavior in the conditions that war actually produced. A vehicle that looked underpowered on paper could still outperform a more powerful vehicle in terrain where power was less important than traction, ground clearance, and the reliability of four-wheel drive. The Jeep had been designed to perform in the conditions that war produced. The Kübelwagen had been designed to perform in the conditions that engineers modeled. The two were not the same conditions. Allied intelligence documented it with a specific interest that any acknowledgement of captured enemy equipment by a senior German commander would attract. The officer who had perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of motorized warfare in the German military had, when given the choice between his own nation's light vehicle and the American primitive one, chosen the American primitive one. Across North Africa, American officers were making the same observation in reverse. The Jeep went where other vehicles did not. It crossed terrain that stopped trucks. It could be pushed out of sand by its occupants. It could ford streams too deep for vehicles without four-wheel drive. It could be carried in a glider, dropped by parachute, loaded onto a landing craft, and delivered to wherever the fighting was happening. When the war moved from North Africa to Sicily, the Jeep moved with it. When it moved to Italy, then to England, then to France on D-Day, the Jeep was there. When the war finally reached Germany itself, the Jeep was rolling through the streets of German cities on roads that had been built for German vehicles. The Kübelwagen was more sophisticated, more fuel efficient, better suited to European roads. The product of engineering excellence applied to clear requirements. The requirements had been written for a different war than the one that happened. The Jeep had been designed for the war that happened, not because American engineers could foresee the specific theaters, because they had designed for the worst case, everywhere, under every condition, by people with no specialized training. The worst case turned out to be the war. Primitive and durable are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same thing. Rommel had captured his Jeep in Tunisia in 1942. By the time American Jeeps were driving through German cities, he had been dead for 2 years, forced to suicide after his involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler was discovered. The Jeep outlasted him. It outlasted the war. It outlasted the Wehrmacht, the Third Reich, and the generation of German engineers who had examined one in 1941 and written their assessment. The primitive vehicle proved more durable than the sophisticated assessment of it. That was not an accident. It was the point. The German military had a vehicle problem, not a shortage of vehicles. The problem was the wrong kind, in the wrong configuration, maintained by the wrong system. The Wehrmacht, at the height of its power, operated over 2,000 different types and models of vehicles. Not 2,000 vehicles, 2,000 types. Trucks from a dozen manufacturers, cars with incompatible parts, motorcycles with different engines than their sidecars, artillery tractors that shared no components with the supply trucks that theoretically supported them. A spare part for a Horch staff car did not fit a Mercedes command vehicle. A mechanic trained on one engine could not necessarily repair another. A supply system stocking parts for 2,000 different types could never have enough of any single part. The Wehrmacht's logistical complexity was the direct result of its engineering sophistication. Germany had excellent vehicle manufacturers. Each one had produced excellent vehicles. The excellence was individual and incompatible. The American military had solved this problem before it became a problem. The standardization Probst had built in, interchangeable parts, accessible maintenance points, a single engine type across hundreds of thousands of vehicles, was a deliberate requirement. The vehicle must be maintainable by soldiers with basic training using standard tools. The result was that the same spare parts worked in every Jeep in every theater of the war. A mechanic who had serviced a Jeep in North Africa could service one in Normandy without retraining. A supply depot in England could ship the same parts to France, Italy, and the Pacific, because the same parts fit every vehicle. The Jeep's apparent simplicity was, in its logistics, a form of genius. The genius of a system that had thought through not just the vehicle, but the entire chain of maintenance, supply, and repair that would keep 640,000 vehicles running across multiple continents. The Wehrmacht could not achieve this. Its 2,000 vehicle types created a logistics nightmare. German supply officers spent enormous energy managing incompatibility. German mechanics spent time they did not have learning new systems. German supply chains carried parts specific to single vehicle types and useless for everything else. The American supply officer managing a Jeep fleet had one part number for an engine, one for a carburetor, one for each component. The German supply officer managing an equivalent mix had dozens. The American supply sergeant who needed a carburetor for a Jeep sent one order. The German supply sergeant sent one of 17 different orders depending on which vehicle had broken down. The Jeep was the American vehicle system at work, 640,000 of them, one part number per component. When the Wehrmacht captured American Jeeps, which they did regularly, and used when they could keep them supplied with fuel, German officers noted that their own mechanics could learn to maintain them faster than other captured American vehicles. The Jeep was simple enough that basic mechanical knowledge transferred quickly. This was Probst's 18-hour design decision playing out across the entire war. The Wehrmacht's 2,000 vehicle types meant that expertise was fragmented. A master mechanic on one vehicle type was a beginner on the next. The Jeep's simplicity meant that expertise accumulated, one set of skills applicable to 640,000 vehicles in every theater. A 19-year-old who had learned to maintain a Jeep in England could maintain one in Normandy, could maintain one in Germany, could maintain one in the Pacific if the war had required it. The skills traveled with the soldier. The vehicle was the same everywhere. The part numbers were the same everywhere. This was not engineering. This was strategy expressed through engineering. And the German engineers who had assessed the Jeep as primitive in 1941 had not been evaluating the strategy. They had been evaluating the vehicle. The vehicle was the wrong unit of analysis. The German engineers in 1941 had seen a primitive vehicle. They had been looking at the wrong thing. On June 6, 1944, Jeeps hit the beaches of Normandy. Within hours of the initial assault, as the beaches began to be secured and logistics began to flow ashore, the Jeeps came. Off-landing craft, in gliders, landed inland with airborne troops, in the holds of Liberty ships, driven off ramps onto beaches that were still under fire. Moving everything from the beaches and supply dumps to the units fighting inland required transportation. The Jeep was that transportation, at every level. It carried officers forward to observe the fighting. It carried wounded backward to the aid stations. It carried radio operators who needed to be where the fighting was happening to direct artillery and air support. It ran messages when radio communications failed. It scouted roads. It pulled artillery pieces when tractors were not available. It mounted machine guns at checkpoints and .50 caliber heavy machine guns on improvised field modifications. The supply officer who wanted to understand how the Red Ball Express functioned needed to understand that the Jeep was how it was organized and managed at the unit level. The German army in the same period was moving on feet and horses. The German infantry divisions that were the backbone of the Wehrmacht's defensive line were moving as infantry divisions had always moved, on foot, with horses pulling the artillery and supply wagons. A German infantry division was authorized approximately 4,800 horses and several hundred motor vehicles of multiple incompatible types, maintained by specialists in specific families, supplied by a chain that struggled with incompatibility. The American Infantry Division had approximately 1,400 vehicles, a significant portion of them Jeeps, maintained by mechanics who had learned on Jeeps, supplied by a chain that stocked Jeep parts, operated by soldiers who had trained on Jeeps in the United States, who had driven Jeeps in England, who could get into a Jeep anywhere in the theater and drive it without instruction. This last quality, the transferability of the skill, the fact that the vehicle was the same everywhere and could be operated by anyone who had ever operated one, was not in the engineering specifications. It was a consequence of the engineering philosophy: simple, standardized, consistent. One Jeep was every Jeep. One German vehicle was not every German vehicle. The mobility difference between an American infantry division and a German infantry division in Normandy in 1944 was not primarily a difference in manpower or firepower. It was a difference in vehicles. And the vehicle difference was not primarily about the trucks, which both armies had. It was about the Jeep. The German commanders watching the American advance in Normandy in July and August of 1944 made notes in their situation reports about the mobility of American forces. They noted that American units moved faster than German units. They noted that American command and control seemed to function at speeds their own could not match. They noted that American officers appeared at the front lines with a frequency that German officers could not duplicate. The connection was there. The American officer who could drive himself to an observation post in a Jeep and return to his command post in 30 minutes was making decisions with information that was 30 minutes old. The German officer who had to walk or wait for a vehicle to be assigned or rely on a messenger was making decisions with information that was hours old. The value of information decays rapidly in modern warfare. A situation report 2 hours old may describe a situation that no longer exists. The Jeep gave American commanders 30-minute information. The German vehicle system gave German commanders older information. This was not a firepower advantage. It was a decision advantage. And decisions determine outcomes. The Jeep could do things that had never been done before, not because it was a technological breakthrough, because it was a practical one. A vehicle capable enough, simple enough, and small enough to be used in ways no previous military vehicle had been used at scale. In the Pacific, the Jeep's versatility took on dimensions the European campaign had not required. Jungle, volcanic rock, beaches ending at dense vegetation, roads that were not roads. Modified for field ambulance duty, the Jeep could carry wounded soldiers from forward positions that standard ambulances could not reach. One Marine Corps surgeon designed a variant that could transport 35 patients 1,000 yards and return in an hour. Modified for reconnaissance, it scouted roads and enemy positions ahead of advancing columns. Modified for communications, it carried the radio equipment that kept units in contact with commanders, air support, and artillery. The German equivalents were specialized, purpose-built for specific tasks, requiring specific training, stocked with specific parts. The American approach? One vehicle, modified as needed, same skills and parts regardless of modification. It was not just a vehicle, it was a platform. The Germans had platforms too. The half-track was versatile, but it was complex, expensive, and required specialized maintenance. Not something a company commander could have his own mechanics modify in a week using available materials. The Jeep was. And this quality, the adaptability, the capacity to be made into whatever the situation required, was never in a specification document. It emerged from Probst's design philosophy. Make it simple, make it accessible, make it work. When soldiers needed a litter carrier, they built one on a Jeep. When they needed a rocket launcher platform, they mounted one on a Jeep. When they needed a wire-laying vehicle for communications cable, they rigged a Jeep for it. Improvised ambulance, machine gun mount, light artillery prime mover, reconnaissance vehicle, command car, Jeep. Always the Jeep. In North Africa, Jeeps crossed desert terrain that stopped heavier vehicles. In Sicily and Italy, they climbed mountain roads trucks could not navigate. In the Pacific, they went through jungle that had no roads at all. In France, they found ways through the bocage, the cratered roads, the destroyed bridges. Every theater produced a new requirement. Every requirement produced a new modification. Every modification was built on the same vehicle, maintained with the same skills, supplied with the same parts. The platform was the strategy. 640,000 vehicles, endless configurations, one set of maintenance skills, one set of parts. The arithmetic of the system, working exactly as Probst had designed it to work, in 18 hours in July 1940. The German engineers who had assessed the Jeep in 1941 had seen a primitive vehicle because they had been looking at what it was. They had not been looking at what it could become. That capacity to become, to be modified and adapted and improvised upon by any soldier with a wrench and a need, was the Jeep's most important quality. Invisible in a laboratory, visible in a war. Hugh Cole had asked his question. Every Wehrmacht general named the Jeep. the Jeep, the small, primitive four-wheel drive vehicle that had been designed in 18 hours and built 640,000 times and driven by every American soldier in every theater under every condition that the war produced. The generals had watched the Jeep in operation. They had faced armies that used Jeeps. They had seen what American commanders could do that German commanders could not. They had traced that speed back to its source. The source was a quarter-ton, four-wheel drive vehicle with a 60-horsepower engine and an open body and no protection from the rain. Primitive, decisive, both at the same time. That was what the German engineers in 1941 had not understood, looking at their captured American vehicle and writing their accurate, wrong assessment. Primitive and decisive were not opposites. In the conditions that the Second World War produced, they were the same thing. The Wehrmacht generals who spoke to Hugh Cole after the war were not naive men. They had commanded formations in the most technically sophisticated military operations in history. They had managed combined arms warfare, the coordination of armor, infantry, artillery, air power, and logistics that the Second World War required, at a level of professional competence that their post-war interviewers consistently acknowledged. They knew what military equipment looked like. They had access to captured American equipment throughout the war. They had examined Sherman tanks and studied M1 carbines and evaluated C-47 transport planes and assessed the American quartermaster system. They had professional opinions about all of it. When they said the Jeep was the single piece of American equipment they admired most, they were not making a sentimental choice. They were making a professional assessment. The assessment was, of all the things the Americans had, the Jeep was the thing that most consistently gave the American army an advantage that the German army could not replicate. Not because Germany lacked vehicles, it had excellent vehicles. Not because Germany lacked production capacity, it had substantial production capacity. Because the Jeep represented a philosophy, a specific, deliberate decision about what a military vehicle was for, that German military planning had not internalized. The German military vehicle philosophy, expressed across the 2,000 types that plagued its logistics, was build excellent vehicles for the specific tasks they will be required to perform. A staff car should be an excellent staff car. A reconnaissance vehicle should be an excellent reconnaissance vehicle. A supply truck should be an excellent supply truck. The American military vehicle philosophy, expressed in the Jeep, was build one vehicle that can do everything adequately and build 640,000 of them. Adequate everywhere versus excellent somewhere. The Wehrmacht had the excellent vehicles. The American Army had the adequate vehicle that was everywhere. And the everywhere vehicle won. This was not obvious in 1941 when the German engineers wrote their assessment. Germany was winning the war in 1941. Its military vehicles, sophisticated and purpose-built, were performing their roles in the campaigns that had conquered most of Europe. The Kübelwagen was doing what it had been designed to do. The problems emerged as the war changed, as the distances grew longer, as the supply chains stretched thinner, as the theaters multiplied, as the demand for vehicles in multiple roles simultaneously exceeded what the specialist inventory could provide. A Jeep could replace a Kübelwagen in a reconnaissance role. It could replace a staff car for transporting officers. It could replace a small truck for moving supplies. It could replace an ambulance for evacuating casualties. It could replace a motorcycle for carrying messages. One vehicle, 6 roles. 640,000 vehicles. 3,840,000 roles filled by the same vehicle with the same parts and the same mechanics. The German army needed 6 specialist vehicles to fill those roles. By 1944, under the pressure of attrition on multiple fronts, the specialist vehicles were wearing out faster than they could be replaced, and the parts for each type were becoming harder to obtain. The American Jeep fleet was also under pressure, but when a Jeep wore out, it was replaced by another Jeep, identical, interchangeable, maintained by the same skills with the same parts. The German vehicle fleet, when it wore out, was replaced by whatever was available, which was often a different type, requiring different parts, creating new complexity in an already complex system. The Wehrmacht generals understood this by the end of the war. Some had understood it earlier. The ones who had captured jeeps in North Africa and kept them had understood it very early. They had understood it the way Rommel understood it, behind the wheel of a vehicle he had taken from an enemy who had figured out something his own military had not. Function. Everywhere. That was the point. The Jeep crossed the Rhine on March 7, 1945. American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before the Germans could destroy it. In the hours after, everything that could move was pushed across to exploit the bridgehead. Jeeps went across the Ludendorff Bridge. They went across carrying officers who needed to see the situation on the eastern bank. They went across carrying communications equipment to establish contact with the units crossing. They went across carrying ammunition and supplies. They went across as they had gone across every bridge and ford and improvised crossing in the entire campaign, because wherever the American army went, the Jeep went. The last great barrier between Allied forces and the German heartland was the same as every other river. The Jeep crossed it. The German engineers who had assessed the Jeep in 1941 had been assessing a vehicle that was, at that moment, no more than a prototype being tested in the Maryland countryside. They had been assessing it against the standards of the war Germany expected to fight. A short, decisive war in which engineering excellence would produce military results before the logistical demands of a longer conflict became relevant. The war Germany expected was not the war that happened. The war that happened lasted 6 years, spanned 6 continents, and was decided, as Marshall had recognized, not by the most sophisticated weapons, but by the systems most consistently present, most reliably maintained, most adaptable to the conditions the war actually produced. The Jeep was all three. Present, 640,000 vehicles in every theater, on every front. Reliable, simple enough to be maintained by any mechanic with basic training, with parts interchangeable across every vehicle in the fleet. Adaptable, a platform that soldiers modified for whatever the battlefield required, from ambulances to rocket launchers, from command vehicles to reconnaissance cars. The German vehicle fleet had been present, reliable, and adaptable in 1939 and 1940. By 1944, the complexity of the system had eroded all three. The American Jeep fleet was also under pressure, but when a Jeep wore out, it was replaced by another Jeep, identical, interchangeable, maintained by the same skills with the same parts. The German vehicle fleet, when it wore out, was replaced by whatever was available, which was often a different type, requiring different parts, creating new complexity in an already complex system. Karl Probst, who had drawn the design in 18 hours in July 1940, lived until 1963. His name was not famous. His vehicle was one of the most recognized in the world. Engineers design things. Sometimes the things matter enormously. Bantam Car Company, the only manufacturer willing to try to meet the Army's impossible timeline, did not survive the war. The contracts went to Willys and Ford. The company that had first built the Jeep did not profit from its success. Willys Overland did. Ford did. And the American Army, which had commissioned the vehicle, specified its requirements and forced the standardization that made it producible at scale, profited most of all. In the currency of military campaigns and the war the Jeep had helped win. The engineers in 1941 had assessed it as primitive. By 1945, it had driven through every country in Europe. It had crossed deserts and jungles and mountain passes and beaches and rivers and the bombed-out streets of German cities. It had carried presidents and generals and private soldiers and the wounded and the dead. It had been everywhere, and everywhere it had worked. The war ended in May 1945 in Europe. American forces left Jeeps behind in the countries where the war had been fought. Local populations found them and discovered what American soldiers had discovered years earlier. The vehicle worked everywhere. That had been the specification. Probst had met it in 18 hours. General Marshall had been right. It was America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. Not because it was the most powerful, because it was the most present. The engineers in 1941 had been right too. It was primitive. The primitive vehicle had crossed the Rhine. That, in the end, was the assessment that mattered. The principle that made the Jeep work has a name. The right tool for a job is not the most sophisticated tool available, but the one that best fits the specific constraints of the situation. The available skills, the available materials, the conditions under which the tool will be used, and the scale at which it will need to operate. The Jeep was appropriate technology, not the most powerful, not the most sophisticated, not the most impressive to German automotive engineers in a testing facility, the most appropriate. A vehicle that a 19-year-old with no mechanical training could operate, that a 22-year-old with basic training could maintain, that could be modified by anyone with a welding torch and a need, that could go anywhere, that could be produced by the millions. German military vehicle procurement was organized around excellence, the best possible vehicle for each specific role. Each vehicle was optimized for its role and therefore not suitable for any other. In a 6-year war demanding flexibility at every level, the optimization became a liability. The Wehrmacht generals who told Hugh Cole that the Jeep was the single thing they admired most in the American arsenal were not admiring it for what it was. They were admiring it for what it could do. The distinction matters. A German engineer evaluating the Jeep looked at what it was: the engine, the suspension, the body, the specifications. A German general evaluating the Jeep had watched it in the field, had seen what it could do in conditions that the engineer's assessment had not modeled. The engineer evaluated a vehicle. The general evaluated a capability. The capability: be everywhere, do anything, keep working. The vehicle was primitive. The capability was decisive. This was what Eisenhower understood when he listed it among the 4 tools that won the war. This was what Marshall understood when he called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. They were praising the result, the specific, practical consequence of Probst's 18-hour decision and the Army's standardization requirement, and Willys and Ford's mass production. 640,000 vehicles, every theater, every role, the same parts, the same maintenance skills, the same driver who had learned on one could drive another. This was the product of a deliberate philosophy that the German military had not adopted, toward the specific and sophisticated rather than the universal and simple. The American military itself has not always applied the Jeep lesson. The F-22 Raptor is perhaps the finest fighter aircraft ever built. There are 186 of them. The F-16, designed on adequate performance at producible cost, has been built in over 4,600 units and flown by 25 nations. The echo of the Jeep versus Kubelwagen debate persists. The question has not changed. What is a weapon for? For winning individual tests or for winning wars? For impressing the engineers who evaluated in a testing facility? Or for being everywhere, doing anything, keeping working under conditions that no testing facility can fully model? Probst answered the question in 18 hours in July 1940. The war confirmed the answer over 6 years on 6 continents. The German engineers had been right about the vehicle. They had been wrong about the war. The vehicle they had dismissed as primitive had done something that no amount of sophisticated engineering could have achieved. It had been everywhere, always, for the duration. 640,000 times. In the deserts of North Africa, and the jungles of New Guinea, and the hedgerows of Normandy, and the mountains of Italy, and the streets of Germany itself. Present, always present. And in a war that lasted 6 years and was fought on 6 continents, presence, the specific, unglamorous, undramatic quality of being there when needed, was the decisive quality. Not power, not precision, not the sophistication that engineers measured in their assessments. Presence. The Jeep had that, in abundance, 640,000 times over. The Jeep is still being produced, not the same vehicle, The modern Jeep Wrangler shares its name and its basic philosophy with the World War II original, not its specifications. But the lineage is direct. The vehicle that Probst designed in 18 hours in July 1940 is the ancestor of a vehicle still in production 80 years later, still sold to militaries and civilians around the world, still recognized instantly by anyone who sees it. The Willys MB and the Ford GPW sit in museums now, glass cases and outdoor exhibits, surrounded by signs listing their specifications. Four-cylinder engine, 60 horsepower, open body, rudimentary suspension, primitive. The service history is different from anything the German engineers imagined. North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, southern France, the Rhineland, Germany itself, the Pacific, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Philippines, Okinawa. Every theater where American soldiers fought, in every condition those theaters produced. 640,000 vehicles, 360,000 from Willys, 280,000 from Ford, 2,675 from Bantam, who had invented it and could not survive the war it had made possible. The vehicle Rommel had captured and kept, that Marshall had called America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, that Eisenhower had included in his list of 4 tools that won the war, that every Wehrmacht general had named when Hugh Cole asked his question, was the product of an 18-hour design session by an engineer meeting an impossible deadline. The deadline had been 49 days. Probst had taken 18 hours. He had designed a primitive vehicle. He had also designed the philosophy that made it decisive: function over elegance, simplicity over sophistication, universal over specialized, producible over perfect. The German engineers had seen the vehicle. They had not seen the philosophy. The philosophy was invisible in the specifications. It was only visible in what the vehicle could do, in the 640,000 Jeeps that went everywhere and did everything, and kept working when nothing else could. The Wehrmacht generals saw it. They had been watching it for years from the other side of the conflict, watching American units do things their own units could not do, at speeds their own command structure could not match, with a consistency that the German vehicle system could not replicate. The answer, when they gave it to Hugh Cole, was simple: the Jeep. Small, ugly, open-bodied, 60 horsepower, 4-wheel drive. Correctly assessed as primitive by a German engineer in 1941. Rommel understood it in 1942, behind the wheel of a captured Jeep in Tunisia. Probst had encoded it in a design drawn in 18 hours. Marshall named it at the war's end. The German engineers came to understand it last. The Jeep had known from the beginning. Those same museums sometimes display captured German vehicles nearby. Kübelwagens, specialist vehicles built with the precision that German engineering applied to every problem. The German vehicles are also in glass cases, also surrounded by signs. The difference is in the numbers. The Jeep, 640,000. The Kübelwagen, approximately 50,000, 12 to 1. Not a production capacity ratio, a philosophy ratio. The ratio of adequate everywhere versus excellent somewhere. Function versus elegance, simple versus sophisticated. The ratio won the war. Not the horsepower, not the suspension, not the specifications that the German engineers had measured. The ratio. 640,000 versus 50,000. Everywhere versus somewhere. German engineers called it primitive. German generals called it the one thing they envied most. Both were right. The primitive vehicle won the war. Not because it was the best vehicle, because it was everywhere. Because it was the same everywhere. Because any soldier could drive it and any mechanic could fix it. Presence. In abundance. On 6 continents. For 6 years. Probst had taken 18 hours to design it. The war took 6 years to prove him right. Every road, every river, every front, every wounded soldier it carried, 640,000 times. The primitive vehicle won the war.